Mom, we found these expired pills cluttering your bathroom again, my daughter Melissa said, dumping my carefully rationed medications into the trash bag with theatrical disgust. You're becoming a hoarder with all these bottles. What she didn't know was that those expired pills were my lifeline, and the pharmaceutical company that made them had just made me their largest individual shareholder. 3 months later, when my will was read, the silence in that lawyer's office was worth every sleepless night I'd endured. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Dr. Catherine Walsh, and at 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in my home office at 2 in the morning, watching pharmaceutical stock prices fluctuate on my computer screen while rationing blood pressure medication like it was liquid gold. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very companies whose products my family kept throwing away were making me wealthier by the day, but that wealth meant nothing if I couldn't access the medications keeping me alive. My journey into pharmaceutical investing had started innocently enough 15 years ago, when my late husband Richard, a retired chemistry professor, suggested we put some of our retirement savings into healthcare stocks. He'd always been fascinated by the science behind drug development, and his analytical mind had a gift for predicting which companies would succeed. What began as a modest investment in 3 pharmaceutical companies had grown into a portfolio worth over $8 million, spread across dozens of biotech firms, research companies, and major pharmaceutical manufacturers. Richard had passed away 5 years ago, leaving me not just with grief, but with a complex web of investments that continued to multiply in value. The companies we'd invested in were developing breakthrough treatments for diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and neurological disorders. Every month brought news of successful clinical trials, FDA approvals, and patent acquisitions that sent stock prices soaring. I'd become, quite unexpectedly, one of the most successful individual investors in pharmaceutical securities on the West Coast. But success in the stock market couldn't solve the problem living under my own roof. After Richard's death, my daughter Melissa had gradually moved back into my Palo Alto home, ostensibly to help care for me, but increasingly to manage what she deemed my inability to handle my own affairs. She'd brought her unemployed husband Derek and their 2 teenage children, transforming my peaceful retirement into a chaotic household where my needs seemed to rank last on everyone's priority list. The medication issue had started small, as these things often do. Melissa noticed that I kept multiple bottles of the same prescription, some with earlier expiration dates, and decided this was evidence of confusion and hoarding. She appointed herself as my medication manager, throwing away anything she deemed unnecessary and lecturing me about the dangers of keeping expired drugs. What she didn't understand was that my medications were expensive, my insurance had gaps, and sometimes I had to stretch prescriptions by skipping doses, which meant keeping older bottles as backup supplies. My daily routine had become a careful calculation of pills and priorities. The metoprolol for my heart condition cost $300 a month after insurance. The lisinopril for blood pressure was another $200. The diabetes medication Melissa had thrown away last week would have cost $400 to replace immediately. I found myself choosing which conditions to treat on any given day, a dangerous game that my family interpreted as forgetfulness rather than financial necessity. The cruel irony was that I owned substantial shares in the very companies manufacturing these medications. My portfolio included significant holdings in Pfizer, whose blood pressure medications I couldn't afford to replace when Melissa discarded them. I owned stock in Novo Nordisk, maker of the diabetes treatments she'd declared expired and dangerous. My investments in smaller biotech firms developing heart medications had tripled in value over the past year. But that paper wealth couldn't be converted to pills in my medicine cabinet without selling shares, which would trigger massive tax consequences I wanted to avoid. Melissa had also appointed herself as my financial advisor, despite having no background in investments or taxation. She'd been pressuring me to liquidate my stock portfolio, claiming it was too risky for someone my age, and that I should put everything into safe, low-yield bonds. She spoke about my pharmaceutical investments with particular disdain, calling them gambling and suggesting that healthcare stocks were unethical because they profited from human suffering. Her husband Derek nodded along with these pronouncements while researching the latest prices of my holdings on his phone when he thought I wasn't watching. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically since they'd moved in. Derek had lost his job as a mid-level marketing manager 18 months ago and showed no urgency about finding new employment. Instead, he'd become very interested in my financial affairs, asking pointed questions about my investment accounts and suggesting that I was getting too old to handle complex financial decisions. Their teenage children, Madison and Tyler, treated my home like a free hotel, leaving messes throughout the house and showing no respect for my personal space or belongings. Melissa had started making medical appointments for me without consultation, often canceling or rescheduling visits I'd arranged with specialists who understood my medication regimen. She accompanied me to every doctor's visit, speaking for me and describing symptoms I hadn't experienced while downplaying the severity of conditions I was actually struggling with. She'd convinced my primary care physician that I was becoming forgetful about medications, which led to simplified prescriptions that didn't adequately address my complex health needs. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when I discovered Melissa in my bathroom, systematically emptying every medication bottle into a large trash bag. She'd enlisted Madison to help her, and they were laughing about the ridiculous number of pills I kept around the house. I watched in horror as medications I'd carefully preserved for emergencies disappeared into the garbage, including a nearly full bottle of expensive heart medication I'd been saving for the gap period before my insurance coverage renewed. When I protested, Melissa launched into a well-rehearsed lecture about medication safety and the dangers of keeping expired prescriptions. She presented a printed article about elderly people accidentally overdosing on old medications and suggested that my protests were evidence of cognitive decline. Derek appeared in the doorway, nodding seriously and adding his own concerns about my mental state and ability to live independently. The coordinated nature of their response suggested they'd been planning this intervention for some time. That afternoon, while the family was out shopping with my credit card, I sat in my home office calculating the cost of replacing the medications they'd destroyed. The total came to over $1,500, money I didn't have readily available, without dipping into accounts that Melissa had been monitoring. I pulled up my investment portfolio on the computer, watching the green numbers that represented millions in pharmaceutical stock gains, and felt the bitter irony of my situation settle like lead in my stomach. I owned shares in companies whose products could save my life, but I couldn't afford to purchase those products because my family controlled my immediate access to cash and kept destroying the medications I managed to acquire. The profits from my pharmaceutical investments were substantial enough to buy medications for a small hospital, but
preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Converting those investments to usable cash required planning and tax strategy that my family was actively working to prevent. That evening, Melissa announced that she'd made an appointment with an elder care attorney to discuss my living situation and financial management. She spoke in the caring tone she'd perfected, expressing concern about my ability to handle medications safely and manage complex investments appropriately. Derek added that they'd been researching assisted living facilities that specialized in medication management, places where trained professionals could ensure I received appropriate care without the confusion of managing my own prescriptions. The message was clear, though delivered with smiles and expressions of love. They wanted control over my living situation and my financial assets. The medication disposal wasn't about safety. It was about demonstrating my incompetence to justify their increasing control over my life. Every thrown-away pill was evidence they could present to doctors, lawyers, and courts to prove I was no longer capable of independent living. I spent that night researching my legal options and reviewing my investment portfolio with new eyes. The pharmaceutical stocks that Melissa dismissed as risky gambling represented not just financial security but autonomy. These companies were developing the very medications I needed to survive, and their success was directly tied to my well-being in ways my family couldn't understand. The profits from these investments could fund my independence for the rest of my life, but only if I could maintain control over them. As I sat in the darkness of my home office, surrounded by the quiet hum of computers displaying millions in stock valuations, I realized that my family's campaign to control my medications was really a campaign to control my future. They saw an elderly woman with pill bottles and assumed incompetence. They saw investment portfolios and assumed confusion. What they failed to see was a sharp mind that had been building wealth, while they struggled with basic employment and financial responsibility. The war for my independence was about to begin, and I had weapons they couldn't imagine. My pharmaceutical investments weren't just numbers on a screen. They were leverage, influence, and power in an industry that literally held life and death in its hands. While my family plotted to have me declared incompetent, I was planning something they'd never expect from a confused old woman with too many pill bottles. The next morning brought a new crisis that crystallized everything I'd been thinking about during my sleepless night. I woke to find Derek in my home office, photographing documents from my investment portfolio that I'd accidentally left on the desk. When I confronted him, he claimed he was just cleaning and had noticed papers scattered around, but the guilty expression on his face told a different story. He'd been systematically documenting my financial holdings, probably to support their case for taking control of my affairs. Melissa appeared immediately when she heard raised voices, as if she'd been waiting nearby for this exact confrontation. She launched into another lecture about my organizational skills and the importance of keeping important financial documents secure. She suggested that having investment papers scattered around the house was evidence of cognitive decline and that I clearly needed help managing complex financial matters. Derek nodded along, adding his concerns about identity theft and the dangers of leaving sensitive information where anyone could access it. The coordination of their response confirmed my growing suspicion that this was a planned campaign rather than spontaneous concern. They'd been building a case against my competency, documenting every incident of supposed confusion or poor judgment to present to healthcare providers and legal authorities. The medication disposal was just one element of a broader strategy to demonstrate that I was no longer capable of independent living or financial decision-making. I spent the morning calling my various investment brokers and financial advisors, ostensibly to check on recent market activity but actually to assess whether my family had been contacting them independently. What I discovered was alarming. Derek had called my primary investment firm 3 days earlier, claiming to be concerned about my mental state and asking about procedures for family members to gain oversight of elderly clients' accounts. He'd presented himself as a caring son-in-law, worried about my well-being and ability to make sound financial decisions. The conversation with my broker, James Martinez, revealed the full scope of their investigation into my affairs. Derek had asked detailed questions about my pharmaceutical holdings specifically, expressing concern that I was making irrational investment decisions based on personal medical needs rather than sound financial analysis. He'd suggested that my focus on healthcare stocks was evidence of confused thinking, and that the family was considering seeking guardianship to protect my assets from poor decision-making. James had handled the inquiry professionally, explaining that client confidentiality prevented him from discussing my accounts with anyone not authorized in writing. But he'd been alarmed enough by Derek's approach to make notes in my file. He warned me that Derek had seemed unusually well-informed about my investment strategy and portfolio composition, suggesting that someone had been providing him with detailed information about my holdings. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. Not only was my family working to have me declared incompetent, they were actively sabotaging my relationships with financial professionals and gathering intelligence to support their case. The medications they threw away weren't just expensive pills, they were props in a performance designed to demonstrate my inability to care for myself safely. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my estate planning attorney, Margaret Chen, and scheduled an emergency appointment for the following day. I explained that I needed to review my will and make some significant changes to my beneficiary designations. Margaret had handled my legal affairs for over a decade and understood both the complexity of my financial situation and the value of my pharmaceutical investments. The conversation with Margaret was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. She revealed that Melissa had contacted her office 2 weeks earlier, asking about procedures for having someone declared mentally incompetent and gaining conservatorship over their affairs. Melissa had presented herself as a concerned daughter, worried about my declining cognitive abilities and poor financial judgment. She'd specifically mentioned my pharmaceutical investments as evidence of irrational decision-making, claiming that I was obsessed with healthcare stocks because of my own medical needs. Margaret had declined to provide specific legal advice without my consent, but she'd been concerned enough about the inquiry to make detailed notes. She explained that conservatorship proceedings were serious legal matters that required substantial evidence of incompetency, but that family members often built cases gradually by documenting incidents of supposed confusion or poor judgment. The pattern Melissa was establishing, medication mismanagement, financial obsessions, organizational problems, could potentially support a conservatorship petition if presented effectively. The revelation that my family had been laying legal groundwork for taking control of my life was terrifying, but it also clarified my own strategy. If they wanted to play games with my competency, I'd show them exactly how competent I could be. My pharmaceutical investments weren't just financial assets. They were tools I could use to demonstrate my continued sharp thinking and strategic planning abilities. I spent the rest of the week conducting what I privately called reconnaissance. I monitored my family's conversations, documented their behavior, and carefully observed their routines. What I discovered was a household running on my financial support, while simultaneously working to undermine my autonomy. Derek spent his days researching my investment accounts and making calls about elder care options. Melissa scheduled medical appointments designed to establish a record of my declining capabilities. The teenagers used my house, my food, and my utilities while showing no respect for my personal space or property. The final straw came when I overheard Derek on the phone with someone discussing the potential value of my pharmaceutical stock portfolio and how quickly it could be liquidated once they gained control. He was treating my life's work building those investments as a windfall they were entitled to claim, rather than assets I'd carefully accumulated through years of research and strategic thinking. The casual way he discussed spending my money while simultaneously working to have me declared incompetent was breathtaking in its audacity. That night, I made the calls that would set my plan in motion. I contacted James Martinez and instructed him to prepare for some significant changes to my investment strategy. I called Margaret Chen and confirmed our appointment to revise my estate planning documents. Most importantly, I reached out to Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations, and scheduled a comprehensive cognitive assessment to establish a baseline of my mental capabilities. My family had made a critical error in their campaign against me. They'd assumed that an elderly woman with medical needs and pharmaceutical investments was inherently vulnerable and confused. What they failed to recognize was that those same investments had made me wealthy, connected, and powerful in ways they couldn't imagine. The companies I owned stock in weren't just abstract financial holdings. They were relationships I'd cultivated over years of careful investment and strategic thinking. As I prepared for bed that night, knowing it might be one of my last peaceful evenings in my own home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not fear or resignation, but anticipation. My family wanted to control my life and my assets by portraying me as incompetent. Instead, they were about to learn exactly how competent I could be when properly motivated. The pharmaceutical stocks they dismissed as confused elderly obsession were about to become the instruments of their own downfall. Every medication they threw away had strengthened my resolve. Every time they questioned my judgment, they'd underestimated my capabilities. Every plan they made to control my future had ignored the possibility that I might have plans of my own. Tomorrow would begin the most important investment strategy of my life, one where the stakes weren't measured in dollars but in dignity, autonomy, and the right to control my own destiny. My family had chosen to wage war against my independence. They had no idea that they'd just declared war against someone who owned substantial pieces of the most powerful industry in the world. The medications they'd thrown away were replaceable. The trust they'd shattered was not. But the pharmaceutical empire I'd built through years of careful investment was about to teach them a lesson about respecting their elders that they'd never forget. The same industry that created the pills they carelessly discarded was going to give me the power to discard them from my life just as easily. My name was Dr. Catherine Walsh, and I'd spent a lifetime underestimated by people who confused age with weakness. My family was about to learn that this particular elderly woman had been quietly accumulating not just wealth, but influence in an industry that could make or break their futures. The war for my independence was about to begin, and I held all the weapons that mattered. The meeting with Dr. Patricia Hoffman changed everything I thought I knew about my own mental capabilities and my family's perception of them. Her evaluation was comprehensive, spanning 3 hours across 2 sessions, testing everything from memory recall to complex problem-solving abilities. When she delivered her assessment to me privately, her words carried the weight of professional authority that would be impossible for my family to dismiss. Mrs. Walsh, your cognitive function tests place you in the 95th percentile for your age group, Dr. Hoffman said, reviewing her detailed notes. Your memory, reasoning abilities, and executive function are not only normal but exceptional. There's absolutely no evidence of dementia, cognitive decline, or any condition that would impair your judgment regarding personal care or financial decisions. She paused, studying my face carefully before continuing. However, I am concerned about what appears to be a systematic campaign to undermine your confidence and autonomy. The behaviors you've described from your family members are consistent with financial abuse patterns I've seen in elder care cases. They're creating artificial evidence of incompetence while isolating you from resources and support systems. The validation was overwhelming. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions as my family's narrative of my declining capabilities became more insistent. Dr. Hoffman's assessment confirmed what I'd suspected, but had been afraid to trust. My judgment was sound, my memory was sharp, and my financial acumen was intact. The problem wasn't my competence. It was my family's greed and their willingness to destroy my reputation to access my assets. Dr. Hoffman provided me with detailed written documentation of her evaluation, including specific test scores and professional observations that would be admissible in any legal proceeding. She also made recommendations for protecting myself from continued psychological manipulation, including strategies for documenting abuse and maintaining independence despite family pressure. Armed with this professional validation, I returned home to find Derek in my kitchen, speaking on the phone with someone about liquidation timelines and portfolio diversification. He ended the call quickly when he saw me, but not before I heard him mention specific pharmaceutical companies that matched my investment holdings. The casual way he discussed my assets as if they were already under his control was infuriating, but also strategically useful. Every conversation I overheard was evidence of their premature celebration and planning. That evening, Melissa announced that she'd scheduled a family meeting for the following Sunday to discuss my living situation and care needs. She'd invited my sister Eleanor from Portland and my nephew David from San Francisco, framing the gathering as a necessary intervention for my own safety and well-being. The guest list was carefully chosen. Eleanor had always been jealous of my financial success, and David was struggling with his own business debts and would likely support any plan that might eventually benefit him financially. The strategic nature of their timing became clear when Melissa casually mentioned that she'd already been in contact with both Eleanor and David about my supposed decline. She'd been building her case by reaching out to extended family members, describing incidents of confusion and poor judgment that painted me as increasingly unable to care for myself. The Sunday meeting wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be an ambush designed to pressure me into accepting their control. I spent the next few days implementing what I privately called my documentation strategy. I installed discrete recording devices in common areas of my home, legally permissible since it was my property, and I was protecting myself from abuse. I began keeping detailed written records of every interaction with family members, including dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes when possible. Most importantly, I started building evidence of my own competence through strategic communications with financial advisors, healthcare providers, and legal professionals. The breakthrough came when I discovered Derek's notebook hidden in his bedroom, filled with detailed information about my investment portfolio that he couldn't have obtained through casual observation. Page after page contained account numbers, stock symbols, dividend dates, and estimated values that represented months of careful intelligence gathering. He'd been systematically cataloging my assets with the thoroughness of someone preparing for immediate access. More disturbing were his notes about my daily routines, medical appointments, and social interactions. He'd documented every time I forgot a name or misplaced an item, every instance of physical struggle with medications or household tasks, every sign of aging that could be interpreted as decline. The notebook was essentially a prosecution case against my competence, compiled over months while he lived in my home and pretended to care about my well-being. But Derek had made a critical error in his intelligence gathering. His notes included several conversations and incidents that had never actually occurred, dramatic embellishments of minor events, and interpretations of my behavior that revealed more about his intentions than my capabilities. The notebook was evidence of a deliberate campaign to build a false narrative, not legitimate concerns about an elderly relative's well-being. I photographed every page of Derek's notebook before returning it to its hiding place, creating a complete record of their strategy against me. The documentation would be invaluable in any legal proceeding, but it also provided insight into their timeline and expectations. They were planning to move quickly once they established sufficient evidence of my incompetence, with Derek's notes indicating they hoped to gain control of my assets within the next few months. My conversation with Eleanor the day before the family meeting revealed the full scope of their preparation. She called ostensibly to check on my well-being, but the conversation quickly turned to leading questions about my memory, my ability to manage medications, and my judgment regarding financial matters. She'd clearly been coached by Melissa about specific topics to explore and concerns to express. Eleanor's approach was more subtle than Derek's obvious greed, but equally manipulative. She spoke in caring tones about the burden of aging and the difficulty of accepting help from family members. She shared stories about other elderly relatives who'd struggled with independence, and how much better they'd felt once family members took over complicated responsibilities like financial management and medical care. The most revealing moment came when Eleanor mentioned that Melissa had told her about my obsession with pharmaceutical stocks and how this might be related to my own medical anxieties. She suggested that elderly people sometimes made poor investment decisions based on personal fears rather than sound financial analysis, and that my focus on healthcare companies might indicate confused thinking about my own mortality and medical needs. The narrative they'd constructed about my pharmaceutical investments was particularly galling because it revealed how little they understood about my actual investment strategy. My portfolio wasn't based on personal medical anxieties. It was the result of 15 years of careful research, market analysis, and strategic positioning in one of the most profitable and stable sectors of the economy. My healthcare stock holdings had consistently outperformed broader market indices and had made me wealthier than any of my family members could imagine. During that phone conversation with Eleanor, I made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Instead of defending my investment choices or trying to explain my strategy, I played into their narrative while secretly recording the entire conversation. I expressed uncertainty about my pharmaceutical holdings, wondered aloud if I might be too emotionally attached to healthcare stocks, and even suggested that maybe I should consider simplifying my investment approach. Eleanor's response was immediate and telling. She became enthusiastic about my apparent willingness to reconsider my investment strategy, suggesting that family members might be better positioned to make objective financial decisions without the emotional complications of personal medical needs. She volunteered to help research financial advisors who specialized in conservative investment approaches for elderly clients, advisors who could help transition my portfolio to safer, more appropriate holdings. The conversation confirmed that my family's campaign against my competence was directly tied to their desire to control my pharmaceutical investments specifically. They weren't just concerned about my general financial management. They wanted access to stock holdings that had made me exceptionally wealthy and continued to appreciate rapidly. My healthcare portfolio represented millions of dollars in assets that they viewed as their inheritance, currently being mismanaged by an elderly woman with confused priorities. The night before the family meeting, I received an unexpected call from my nephew David that revealed another layer of their coordination. He called late, apparently assuming I'd be asleep, and left a voicemail that he probably intended for Derek or Melissa. The message was brief but illuminating. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding Aunt Catherine's situation. The pharmaceutical stock angle is brilliant. We can present it as evidence of impaired judgment, while positioning ourselves as the rational family members trying to protect her assets from her own confusion. The casual way David discussed using my investment success as evidence against me was breathtaking in its cynicism. My pharmaceutical stocks weren't just valuable assets they wanted to control, they were weapons they planned to use in their campaign to have me declared incompetent. Every dollar I'd made through careful investment and market analysis would be presented as proof that I was making irrational decisions based on personal medical anxieties. I spent that final night before the family meeting preparing for what I knew would be the most important performance of my life. I rehearsed responses to likely accusations, organized documentation of my competence, and prepared strategies for turning their own evidence against them. Most importantly, I finalized arrangements that would demonstrate exactly how competent and forward-thinking my pharmaceutical investment strategy had actually been. The morning of the family meeting, I woke early and spent time reviewing my portfolio performance one final time. Over the past 5 years, my pharmaceutical investments had generated returns that exceeded market averages by significant margins. My holdings in biotech companies developing innovative treatments had appreciated by hundreds of percent as their drugs gained FDA approval and market acceptance. My positions in established pharmaceutical giants had provided steady dividend income while their stock prices climbed with successful drug launches and patent acquisitions. The portfolio they dismissed as confused elderly obsession represented one of the most successful individual investment strategies in the healthcare sector. I'd identified promising companies years before they became widely recognized, accumulated substantial positions during market downturns, and held through volatility that had shaken out less committed investors. My success wasn't luck or medical anxiety, it was the result of disciplined research, strategic thinking, and patience that had compounded into extraordinary wealth. As family members began arriving for the meeting, I felt a calm confidence that surprised me. For months, I'd been defensive about my capabilities and apologetic about my needs. Today, I would demonstrate exactly what those capabilities had accomplished, and what my family's campaign against me was really attempting to steal. The medications they'd thrown away were replaceable, but the respect they'd lost was not. The trust they'd violated would have consequences they couldn't imagine. Eleanor arrived first, carrying a folder of documents and wearing the serious expression of someone prepared to make difficult but necessary decisions. David followed shortly after, looking uncomfortable but determined. Derek and Melissa emerged from their bedrooms with their own folders and notes, clearly prepared for a coordinated presentation. The staging was obvious. This wasn't going to be a family discussion, but a prosecution where I was the defendant in my own home. They arranged themselves around my dining room table like a tribunal, with me seated at one end and them occupying the other chairs with their documents spread before them. The setup was designed to emphasize their unity against my isolation, their preparation against my supposed confusion. What they didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this confrontation far longer than they'd been planning it, and my preparation had been based on actual competence rather than manufactured evidence. Melissa began with what she clearly considered a diplomatic opening, expressing love and concern for my well-being while outlining the family's observations about my declining capabilities. She spoke in the measured tones of someone delivering difficult but necessary truths, describing incidents of confusion, medication, mismanagement, and poor judgment that painted a picture of someone who could no longer safely live independently. Derek added his own observations, pulling out the notebook I'd already photographed and reading from entries that described my supposed deterioration in clinical detail. He spoke about finding expired medications throughout the house, discovering financial documents scattered in unsafe locations, and witnessing episodes of confusion about basic daily activities. His presentation was thorough and damning, clearly designed to establish a pattern of incompetence that would justify their intervention. Eleanor nodded along with their presentation, occasionally adding her own concerns based on our recent phone conversation and Melissa's earlier briefings. She spoke about the difficulty of accepting help as we age, and the importance of family members stepping in when elderly relatives can no longer make sound decisions about their own care and financial management. David's contribution focused specifically on my investment strategy, presenting himself as someone with business experience who understood financial markets and risk management. He expressed concern about my concentration in pharmaceutical stocks, describing it as an inappropriate investment approach for someone my age who should be focused on capital preservation rather than speculative growth. He suggested that my personal medical needs had clouded my judgment about appropriate portfolio diversification and risk tolerance. The coordination of their presentation was impressive in its thoroughness and disturbing in its calculated manipulation of facts. They'd taken legitimate concerns about aging and twisted them into evidence of incompetence. They'd documented normal forgetfulness and presented it as cognitive decline. They'd identified successful investment strategies and reframed them as evidence of impaired judgment. When they finished their presentation, the room fell silent as they waited for my response. They expected defensiveness, confusion, or emotional breakdown that would confirm their narrative about my declining capabilities. Instead, I opened my own folder and began what would prove to be the most satisfying presentation of my life. I started by distributing copies of Dr. Hoffman's cognitive evaluation, watching their faces change as they read professional documentation of my exceptional mental capabilities. The test scores and clinical observations were undeniable evidence that contradicted every claim they'd made about my cognitive decline. Their carefully constructed narrative about my deteriorating mental state crumbled in the face of objective professional assessment. Next, I presented financial documentation showing the performance of my pharmaceutical investments over the past 5 years. The returns were extraordinary by any measure, demonstrating sophisticated market analysis and strategic thinking that had generated wealth far exceeding what any of them had achieved in their own careers. My supposed confusion about financial matters had somehow produced one of the most successful individual investment portfolios in the healthcare sector. I then revealed my knowledge of Derek's intelligence gathering, presenting photographs of his notebook alongside evidence of their coordinated campaign to undermine my competence. The documentation showed months of deliberate manipulation and evidence fabrication that contradicted their claims of spontaneous concern for my well-being. Their supposed love and care was revealed as a calculated strategy to gain control of my assets. The most devastating evidence came when I played recordings of their own conversations, including Eleanor's enthusiastic response to my supposed willingness to reconsider my investment strategy, and David's voicemail about using my pharmaceutical stocks as evidence of impaired judgment. Their own words revealed the true nature of their concerns and the calculated way they'd planned to use my success against me. The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet after their presentation. This was the silence of people whose carefully constructed lies had been systematically demolished by evidence they couldn't refute or explain away. Their expressions ranged from shock to anger to genuine fear as they realized the scope of what I'd discovered about their campaign against me. But I wasn't finished. The evidence of their manipulation and greed was just the foundation for what came next. The real revelation was what I'd decided to do with the pharmaceutical investments they'd been so eager to control. The stocks they'd dismissed as confused elderly obsession were about to become the instruments of their own exclusion from my life and my legacy. The pharmaceutical companies I'd invested in weren't just abstract holdings in my portfolio. They were relationships I'd cultivated through years of shareholder engagement and strategic investment. My substantial positions in these companies had given me influence and connections that my family couldn't imagine. The industry they'd mocked for profiting from human suffering was about to demonstrate exactly how powerful it could be when properly leveraged. As I prepared to reveal the final phase of my strategy, I looked around the table at family members who'd spent months plotting to steal my autonomy and assets. They'd assumed that an elderly woman with medical needs would be an easy target for manipulation and control. They were about to learn that this particular elderly woman had been quietly building an empire in the most powerful industry in the world, and that empire was about to defend itself against their attack. The medications they'd thrown away had been replaced through channels they knew nothing about. The pharmaceutical stocks they'd planned to liquidate were about to be transferred in ways that would ensure they'd never benefit from my success. The family meeting they'd orchestrated to establish control over my life was about to become the moment when they lost any claim to my assets, my affection, or my legacy forever. The morning after confronting my family with evidence of their manipulation, I received a phone call that would transform my defensive strategy into something far more aggressive. Dr. Michael Harrison, CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, was calling personally to discuss my substantial shareholding in his company and a proposal that would change everything about my relationship with the healthcare industry. Meridian Pharmaceuticals was one of my earliest and most successful investments, a mid-sized biotech company that had grown exponentially over the past decade through innovative drug development and strategic acquisitions. My initial investment of $200,000 had grown to over $3 million in current market value, making me one of their largest individual shareholders and someone whose opinion carried significant weight in corporate decisions. Dr. Harrison's call wasn't routine shareholder communication. Meridian was preparing to launch a revolutionary new cardiac medication that had just received FDA approval, and they were looking for strategic investors to participate in a private placement offering that would fund their expanded manufacturing and distribution capabilities. The minimum investment was $5 million. Positioning this opportunity exclusively for institutional investors and exceptionally wealthy individuals. The irony was exquisite. While my family was plotting to have me declared incompetent to manage my pharmaceutical investments, One of the most successful companies in my portfolio was inviting me to participate in an exclusive investment opportunity that few individual investors would ever be offered. The same stocks they viewed as evidence of confused thinking were opening doors to financial opportunities they couldn't imagine. Dr. Harrison explained that Meridian's new cardiac medication represented a breakthrough in treatment effectiveness with significantly reduced side effects compared to existing options. The drug had performed exceptionally well in clinical trials, and early market testing suggested it would capture substantial market share within the first year of launch. Investors in the private placement would receive preferred shares with enhanced voting rights and priority dividend treatment. More intriguingly, he mentioned that Meridian was also exploring strategic partnerships with other pharmaceutical companies in my portfolio, including acquisitions and joint development agreements that could create synergistic value across multiple holdings. My investment strategy had inadvertently positioned me at the center of industry consolidation that could multiply the value of my healthcare stocks beyond anything my family had calculated. The conversation with Dr. Harrison sparked an idea that would prove devastating to my family's plans. If they wanted to portray my pharmaceutical investments as evidence of impaired judgment, I would demonstrate exactly how sophisticated and forward-thinking those investments actually were. The private placement opportunity would serve multiple purposes. It would validate my investment acumen, provide additional leverage in the industry, and create financial structures that would be impossible for my family to understand or control. I spent the next several days conducting due diligence on Meridian's private placement offering, with the same methodical approach I'd used for all my successful investments. I reviewed their financial statements, analyzed market projections for their new cardiac medication, and consulted with independent pharmaceutical industry analysts about the company's competitive position and growth prospects. The research confirmed what Dr. Harrison had suggested. Meridian's new drug represented genuine innovation in cardiac care, addressing treatment gaps that existing medications couldn't fill effectively. The market opportunity was substantial, estimated at over $2 billion annually within 5 years of launch. The company's manufacturing capabilities and distribution partnerships were already in place to support rapid market penetration. More importantly, the private placement terms were extraordinarily favorable for investors. The preferred shares included anti-dilution provisions, enhanced voting rights, and dividend preferences that would provide both income and control benefits. The investment would also include warrants to purchase additional shares at predetermined prices, creating upside potential if the company continued to outperform market expectations. While conducting this research, I discovered something that added another layer of strategic value to the investment opportunity. Several other pharmaceutical companies in my portfolio were already exploring partnership agreements with Meridian, including potential acquisition discussions that could trigger substantial premiums for shareholders. My investment positions in multiple companies gave me unique visibility into industry consolidation trends that individual investors rarely accessed. The revelation that my diverse pharmaceutical holdings were interconnected through potential merger and acquisition activity validated my investment strategy in ways that my family's criticism couldn't touch. What they viewed as obsessive focus on healthcare stocks was actually sophisticated positioning across an industry ecosystem where companies regularly collaborated, acquired each other, and created value through strategic partnerships. I decided to participate in Meridian's private placement offering, but not through conventional investment channels that my family might discover or interfere with. Instead, I would structure the investment through a limited liability company that would provide both privacy and additional legal protection against any future attempts to challenge my financial decisions. The process of establishing Walsh Healthcare Holdings, LLC, required coordination with attorneys, accountants, and investment advisors who understood complex financial structures and tax implications. The legal entity would hold my new Meridian investment, along with selected other pharmaceutical holdings, creating a professionally managed portfolio that would be difficult for anyone to characterize as confused elderly investment behavior. Margaret Chen, my estate planning attorney, was instrumental in structuring the LLC to maximize both tax efficiency and asset protection benefits. The legal entity included provisions that would prevent involuntary transfers of ownership interests, ensuring that my pharmaceutical investments couldn't be seized or liquidated without my explicit consent. The structure also included professional management agreements that would demonstrate ongoing competent oversight of the investments. The establishment of Walsh Healthcare Holdings required comprehensive financial documentation that would serve multiple purposes in my strategy against my family's manipulation. Every legal document, every professional consultation, and every investment decision would be evidence of sophisticated financial planning that contradicted their narrative about my declining capabilities. During this process, I learned something fascinating about the pharmaceutical industry's perception of individual investors like myself. Dr. Harrison mentioned that institutional investors often underestimated the sophistication of individual shareholders, assuming that personal medical needs or emotional attachment to healthcare outcomes would cloud investment judgment. In reality, he'd found that individual investors with healthcare experience often identified market opportunities that institutional analysts missed. This insight reinforced my confidence in both my investment strategy and my broader campaign against my family's manipulation. The same personal experience with healthcare that they characterized as emotional confusion actually provided analytical advantages that had contributed to my investment success. My medical needs hadn't clouded my judgment. They'd enhanced my understanding of market dynamics and treatment gaps that created investment opportunities. The irony became even more pronounced when Derek attempted to interfere with my LLC establishment process. He'd apparently been monitoring my financial communications and became alarmed when he noticed legal and accounting fees that suggested significant financial activity he couldn't identify or control. He confronted me about the expenses, demanding explanations about what he characterized as secretive financial behavior that proved I was making irrational decisions. Derek's reaction to my LLC formation revealed the depth of his entitlement regarding my financial affairs. He genuinely believed that he had the right to monitor and approve my investment decisions, as if my assets were already under his control, pending formal legal proceedings. His anger about my independent financial planning demonstrated that their campaign against my competence was really about gaining immediate access to my wealth, rather than protecting my well-being. The confrontation with Derek provided another opportunity to document his presumptuous attitude toward my assets and his apparent belief that I was no longer entitled to financial privacy or independence. I recorded our conversation, capturing his demands for detailed explanations about my legal expenses and his threats to involve medical professionals if I continued making what he characterized as secretive financial decisions. Derek's threats backfired spectacularly when I revealed that my recent legal expenses were related to sophisticated investment opportunities that demonstrated exactly the kind of financial acumen he claimed I'd lost. The LLC structure wasn't evidence of confusion. It was proof of forward-thinking asset protection and tax planning that few investors his age would understand or implement effectively. The revelation that I was being courted for exclusive investment opportunities by pharmaceutical companies he'd never heard of completely undermined his narrative about my declining financial judgment. The same healthcare stocks he'd criticized as inappropriate for elderly investors were opening doors to private placement offerings that required sophisticated financial credentials and substantial wealth to access. But Derek's most serious miscalculation was his decision to contact Dr. Harrison directly, attempting to investigate my relationship with Meridian Pharmaceuticals and the nature of our recent communications. He presented himself as a concerned family member, worried about elderly financial exploitation, and asked whether the company had specific safeguards against taking advantage of confused elderly investors. Dr. Harrison's response was swift and devastating. He immediately contacted me to report Derek's inquiry and express concern about what appeared to be family interference with my investment decisions. He explained that Derek's questions had raised red flags about potential elder abuse and that Meridian had protocols for protecting shareholders from family financial exploitation. The conversation with Dr. Harrison revealed that Derek's interference had actually strengthened my position with one of my most important investment partners. Instead of raising concerns about my competence, his contact with the company had identified him as a potential threat to my financial independence. Dr. Harrison offered to provide documentation of Derek's inappropriate inquiry if I needed evidence for any legal proceedings regarding family financial abuse. More importantly, Dr. Harrison's call included an invitation that would prove crucial to my broader strategy. Meridian was hosting an exclusive investor conference the following month, bringing together their largest shareholders and institutional partners to discuss industry trends and future investment opportunities. He invited me to attend as one of their most valued individual investors, providing a platform to demonstrate my industry relationships and investment sophistication. The investor conference invitation represented validation that went far beyond financial returns. Meridian was treating me as a respected industry participant whose opinions and investment decisions carried weight in corporate planning. The invitation list included pension fund managers, hedge fund principals, and other institutional investors who managed billions in pharmaceutical assets. Attending the conference would provide irrefutable evidence of my standing in the pharmaceutical investment community and my recognition as a sophisticated investor rather than a confused elderly woman making emotional healthcare decisions. The networking opportunities would also expand my industry relationships and potentially identify additional investment opportunities that could further increase my wealth and influence. The preparation for the investor conference required coordination with my investment advisors and legal team to ensure I could represent my interests effectively in discussions with institutional investors and pharmaceutical executives. The process provided additional documentation of my professional relationships and investment sophistication that would be valuable in any future legal challenges to my competence. During this preparation, I discovered another advantage of my pharmaceutical investment strategy that my family had completely overlooked. My substantial holdings in multiple companies had given me access to industry information and market intelligence that few individual investors ever obtained. The relationships I'd built through years of successful investing were providing competitive advantages that continued to enhance my returns. The pharmaceutical companies in my portfolio regularly shared market research, regulatory insights, and partnership opportunities with their largest shareholders. This access to privileged information wasn't just financially valuable. It demonstrated the level of trust and respect I'd earned within the industry through my consistent investment success and professional behavior. My family's characterization of my pharmaceutical investments as confused elderly obsession was particularly absurd in light of the industry recognition I'd achieved. The companies they dismissed were seeking my participation in strategic initiatives and valuing my input on market developments. The stocks they wanted to liquidate were providing access to opportunities that could multiply my wealth exponentially. The most satisfying development came when I learned about potential acquisition discussions involving 3 companies in my portfolio. The merger activity would likely trigger substantial premiums for shareholders and could result in my pharmaceutical holdings appreciating by hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years. The investment strategy my family criticized was positioned to benefit from industry consolidation they couldn't understand or predict. This potential windfall from merger activity provided the perfect framework for the final phase of my strategy against my family's manipulation. Instead of simply defending my competence and protecting my existing assets, I would demonstrate that their campaign against me had cost them access to generational wealth that my pharmaceutical investments were about to generate. The establishment of Walsh Healthcare Holdings LLC had created legal structures that would ensure my family could never benefit from the investment success they'd tried to steal from me. The entity's operating agreements included specific provisions that would prevent any future attempts to challenge my investment decisions or claim inheritance rights to the assets held within the LLC. More devastatingly, the LLC structure included charitable giving provisions that would direct substantial portions of my pharmaceutical investment gains to medical research and healthcare access initiatives. The very industry my family had mocked for profiting from human suffering would receive the wealth they'd assumed would eventually become their inheritance. The irony was perfect. By attempting to portray my pharmaceutical investments as evidence of impaired judgment, my family had motivated me to structure those investments in ways that would permanently exclude them from any benefit. Their greed and manipulation had triggered legal and financial arrangements that would ensure they received nothing from the wealth they'd tried to steal. As I finalized preparations for the Meridian Investor Conference and completed the legal structures that would protect my assets from family interference, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. My pharmaceutical investments hadn't just made me wealthy. They'd provided the tools and relationships necessary to defend my independence and punish those who'd tried to exploit my vulnerability. The medications my family had thrown away were easily replaceable through industry connections they knew nothing about, The financial assets they'd planned to control were now legally protected in structures they couldn't understand or challenge. The competence they'd questioned was being validated by some of the most successful companies in the world. But the most gratifying aspect of my strategy was its educational value. My family was about to learn exactly what they'd attempted to steal and precisely what their manipulation had cost them. The pharmaceutical industry they'd dismissed was going to teach them a lesson about respecting their elders that they'd remember for the rest of their lives. The conference invitation from Dr. Harrison included a guest list that read like a who's who of pharmaceutical investing. I would be networking with individuals who managed hundreds of billions in healthcare assets and made investment decisions that affected global markets. My presence at this gathering would provide undeniable proof of my sophisticated financial relationships and industry recognition. The same week I received the conference invitation, Eleanor called to follow up on our family meeting and express continued concern about my financial decision-making. She'd apparently been designated as the family spokesperson for continued pressure regarding my pharmaceutical investments and what they characterized as my need for financial oversight and protection. Eleanor's call provided another opportunity to document their ongoing manipulation while secretly gathering intelligence about their next moves. She spoke in caring tones about the family's united concern for my well-being and their desire to help me transition to more appropriate investment strategies for someone my age and health condition. The conversation revealed that they'd been researching legal options for gaining control over my financial affairs, including conservatorship proceedings and guardianship petitions that could override my investment decisions. Eleanor mentioned that they'd consulted with attorneys about the process for protecting elderly family members from their own poor judgment and financial exploitation by outside parties. Their assumption that pharmaceutical companies were exploiting my medical anxieties for financial gain was particularly ironic, given that Derek had just been identified by one of those companies as a potential elder abuse threat. The same industry they characterized as predatory was actually protecting me from their manipulation, while providing opportunities for additional wealth accumulation. Eleanor's call also revealed their timeline for legal action. They were planning to file formal proceedings within the next month, believing they'd gathered sufficient evidence of my incompetence to convince a court that I needed protection from my own financial decisions. The family meeting had been their final attempt at voluntary compliance before pursuing involuntary legal remedies. The urgency of their timeline actually worked in my favor by accelerating my own preparations for defending against their legal challenge. The investor conference would provide high-profile validation of my competence just weeks before their expected court filings. The LLC structures would be fully operational and legally protected before they could initiate any proceedings to freeze or control my assets. Most importantly, I would have additional time to gather evidence of their manipulation and document their real motivations for pursuing control over my financial affairs. Every conversation, every threat, and every attempt to undermine my independence would be documented and preserved for presentation in any legal proceeding they initiated. The pharmaceutical industry connections I'd cultivated over years of successful investing were about to become powerful allies in defending my independence and exposing my family's manipulation. The same companies they dismissed as confused elderly obsession were prepared to testify about my sophisticated investment analysis and professional behavior as a shareholder. The medications they'd thrown away had connected me to an industry that valued my judgment and respected my financial acumen. The stocks they planned to liquidate were providing access to legal and financial resources that would make their manipulation impossible to sustain. The wealth they assumed would become their inheritance was being permanently structured to ensure they'd never benefit from my success. As I prepared for what would prove to be the most important investor conference of my career, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. My family's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also motivated me to achieve things I never would have attempted while feeling secure in their supposed love and support. The pharmaceutical investments they'd criticized had evolved from financial holdings into a comprehensive ecosystem of industry relationships, legal protections, and wealth accumulation strategies that would ensure my independence for the rest of my life. Their attack on my competence had triggered defenses they couldn't imagine, and consequences they'd never anticipated. The same industry that created the medications they'd carelessly discarded was about to demonstrate exactly how powerful it could be when defending one of its most successful individual investors against family exploitation. The war for my independence was escalating beyond their ability to fight, and they had no idea what forces they'd awakened through their greed and manipulation. The Meridian Pharmaceuticals Investor Conference was held at the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, a breathtaking oceanfront resort that perfectly matched the caliber of attendees Dr. Harrison had assembled. As I entered the main ballroom on that crisp October morning, wearing my best navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents my family would never see, I felt a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. The guest list was extraordinary. Portfolio managers from the largest pension funds in the country mingled with hedge fund principals who controlled billions in pharmaceutical investments. Venture capital partners who specialized in biotech startups exchanged business cards with executives from Fortune 500 pharmaceutical companies. And there I was, Dr. Catherine Walsh, 72 years old, recognized as one of the most successful individual investors in the healthcare sector. Dr. Harrison's introduction of me to the assembled group was everything I could have hoped for, and more. He spoke about my 15-year track record of pharmaceutical investing, my ability to identify promising companies years before they gained widespread attention, and my reputation for thorough due diligence and strategic thinking. He mentioned that my investment returns had consistently outperformed industry benchmarks, and that my insights into healthcare market dynamics were valued by company management teams across the sector. The response from other attendees was immediate and gratifying. Several institutional investors approached me during the morning coffee break, seeking my opinions on emerging biotech companies and regulatory trends affecting pharmaceutical development. A hedge fund manager who specialized in healthcare investing asked if I'd be interested in participating in a private investment fund that was being launched specifically for pharmaceutical opportunities. The conversations throughout the morning confirmed what I'd suspected but had never fully appreciated. My pharmaceutical investment strategy hadn't just made me wealthy, it had earned me genuine respect within a highly sophisticated investment community. These professionals, who manage some of the largest pools of capital in the world, treated me as a peer whose opinions carried weight and whose investment decisions were worth studying. During the lunch presentation, Dr. Harrison announced something that would prove to be the final nail in my family's coffin. Meridian was being acquired by Global Health Solutions, one of the largest pharmaceutical conglomerates in the world, for a premium of 40% above the current market price. The acquisition would trigger immediate gains for shareholders that would multiply the value of my Meridian holdings overnight. But the announcement included an additional detail that made the acquisition even more significant for my situation. Global Health Solutions was also acquiring 2 other companies in my portfolio as part of a strategic consolidation of cardiac medication manufacturers. The total value of the acquisition package would result in gains across multiple holdings that would increase my pharmaceutical portfolio value by over $50 million. The magnitude of these gains was staggering, but the timing was perfect for my purposes. My family had been building their case against my competence by arguing that my pharmaceutical investments were risky and inappropriate for someone my age. Instead, those investments were about to generate wealth that few professional investors ever achieved, validating my strategy in the most dramatic way possible. The afternoon sessions of the conference focused on future investment opportunities in pharmaceutical development, including access to private equity funds and venture capital partnerships that were typically reserved for institutional investors. Several fund managers expressed interest in including me in investment opportunities that would require minimum commitments of $10 million or more. The invitations to participate in these exclusive investment vehicles provided additional evidence of my recognition within the pharmaceutical investment community. These fund managers weren't offering opportunities to confused elderly women. They were seeking partnerships with sophisticated investors who had demonstrated consistent success in healthcare investing. This same investment strategy my family wanted to characterize as evidence of impaired judgment was opening doors to opportunities that most individual investors would never access. During the conference networking sessions, I learned something that would prove crucial to the final phase of my strategy against my family's manipulation. Several of the pharmaceutical companies in my portfolio were implementing new shareholder protection programs designed to prevent elder financial abuse and unauthorized interference with investment decisions. These programs provided legal resources and advocacy services for shareholders who faced family pressure to liquidate healthcare investments. The pharmaceutical industry had recognized that elderly investors were often targets for financial manipulation precisely because their healthcare stock holdings were valuable and their medical needs could be used to question their investment judgment. Companies were developing comprehensive programs to protect their shareholders from family exploitation, while ensuring that legitimate concerns about investor competence were properly evaluated through professional channels. Dr. Harrison introduced me to Janet Morrison, the Director of Global Health Solutions Shareholder Protection Program, who explained how the industry was combating elder financial abuse through legal advocacy and professional competency evaluations. The program provided resources that could support shareholders facing family pressure, while ensuring that any legitimate concerns about cognitive decline were addressed through proper medical and legal channels. Janet's explanation of the Shareholder Protection Program revealed that my situation wasn't unique. Pharmaceutical companies regularly encountered family members who attempted to force liquidation of healthcare investments by challenging elderly shareholders' competence. The industry had developed sophisticated responses to these challenges that could provide powerful support for investors facing family manipulation. The most remarkable aspect of the Shareholder Protection Program was its access to legal resources and expert testimony that could defend against conservatorship proceedings and guardianship petitions. The program maintained relationships with attorneys who specialized in elder law and medical professionals who could provide competency evaluations that courts would find difficult to challenge. Janet offered to enroll me in the Shareholder Protection Program immediately, providing access to legal advocacy and expert support that would be invaluable if my family proceeded with their threatened legal action. The enrollment process would create additional documentation of my competence while providing professional resources that could counter any challenge to my investment decisions. The enrollment in Global Health Solutions Shareholder Protection Program required comprehensive documentation of my investment history, competency evaluations, and family situation that would provide powerful evidence for any future legal proceedings. The process would create a professional record of my sophistication as an investor and the manipulative behavior of family members who were attempting to interfere with my legitimate financial decisions. As the conference concluded with a reception overlooking the Pacific Ocean, I reflected on how completely the day had validated my pharmaceutical investment strategy and undermined my family's campaign against my competence. The same stocks they wanted to characterize as confused elderly obsession had brought me into contact with some of the most sophisticated investors in the world, who treated me as a respected peer rather than a vulnerable target. The return drive to Palo Alto gave me time to process the full implications of the day's revelations. The acquisition announcements would generate immediate wealth that would dwarf anything my family had imagined possible from my pharmaceutical investments. The industry connections I'd made would provide ongoing opportunities for additional wealth accumulation that could continue for years. Most importantly, the legal resources and professional support I'd gained access to would make their manipulation impossible to sustain. That evening, I found my family gathered in my living room with Derek's laptop open to financial websites, apparently tracking the market reaction to the Meridian acquisition announcement. They were studying stock price movements and calculating potential gains with an intensity that revealed their true motivations more clearly than any recorded conversation ever could. Derek was frantically refreshing browser pages showing Global Health Solutions stock price and acquisition details, while Melissa took notes about the impact on my portfolio value. Eleanor was on the phone with someone, apparently seeking advice about accelerating their legal timeline in light of the sudden increase in my asset values. The coordination of their response to my financial success was more damning than any evidence I'd previously gathered. Their reaction to news of my pharmaceutical portfolio gains revealed that they'd been monitoring my investments far more closely than they'd admitted. Derek's detailed knowledge of my holdings and his immediate calculations of acquisition impacts demonstrated that he'd been tracking my financial performance with the intensity of a professional portfolio manager. Their concern about my competence was directly proportional to their awareness of my wealth. The most revealing aspect of their behavior was their obvious panic about the timing of my windfall relative to their legal proceedings. Eleanor's phone conversation included urgent discussions about whether conservatorship petitions could be expedited, and whether judges would consider recent investment gains as evidence of competence or luck. They understood that my sudden wealth would complicate their narrative about financial vulnerability. I watched them from the kitchen doorway, these family members who'd spent months building a case against my mental capabilities, while secretly cataloging my assets and planning their access to my wealth. The pharmaceutical stocks they'd dismissed as inappropriate elderly investments had just generated gains that exceeded Derek's lifetime earnings, but they still believed they were entitled to control my financial decisions. The following morning brought a phone call that would permanently end any possibility of reconciliation with my family. Melissa had contacted Global Health Solutions directly, presenting herself as my designated caregiver and requesting information about procedures for liquidating acquired shares on behalf of elderly shareholders with cognitive limitations. Her inquiry triggered immediate alerts within the Shareholder Protection Program and resulted in a call to me from Janet Morrison. Janet's report of Melissa's contact with Global Health Solutions was devastating for their legal strategy. The company had documented her false claims about being my designated caregiver and her requests for information about forced share liquidation procedures. The inquiry had raised immediate red flags about potential elder financial abuse and had been forwarded to the legal team that specialized in protecting shareholders from family exploitation. More damaging was Melissa's apparent lack of knowledge about basic investment procedures and shareholder rights, which contradicted her claims about providing financial oversight for my healthcare investments. Her questions revealed fundamental misunderstandings about stock ownership and liquidation processes that demonstrated she was unqualified to make decisions about complex pharmaceutical investments. Global Health Solutions had responded to Melissa's inquiry by informing her that they had protocols specifically designed to prevent unauthorized interference with elderly shareholders' investment decisions. They explained that any concerns about shareholder competence needed to be addressed through proper legal channels with appropriate medical and professional documentation. Her contact with the company had actually strengthened my position by demonstrating attempted interference with my shareholder rights. The documentation of Melissa's inappropriate contact with my investment companies provided additional evidence for my growing case against their manipulation. Every attempt they made to control my financial affairs created professional records that would be difficult to explain or defend in any legal proceeding. Their campaign against my competence was generating evidence of their own inappropriate behavior and presumptuous attitudes toward my assets. That afternoon, I received a call from Margaret Chen with news that accelerated my timeline for implementing the final phase of my strategy. Eleanor had contacted Margaret's office again, this time requesting immediate consultation about emergency conservatorship procedures for elderly family members who were making irrational financial decisions under the influence of outside parties. The urgency of her request suggested they were planning to file legal papers within days rather than weeks. Margaret's report included details about Eleanor's conversation that revealed the full scope of their planned legal strategy. They intended to argue that pharmaceutical companies were taking advantage of my medical anxieties and cognitive limitations to encourage inappropriate, high-risk investments. They would present my recent investment gains as evidence that I was being manipulated rather than proof of my competence. Their legal strategy was particularly cynical because it attempted to use my investment success against me while positioning themselves as protectors trying to rescue me from exploitation. The same pharmaceutical companies that had just validated my sophistication as an investor would be characterized as predators who were taking advantage of elderly vulnerability for profit. Margaret advised me that we needed to implement immediate protective measures before any legal papers were filed. Once conservatorship proceedings began, even frivolous petitions could result in temporary restrictions on my financial activities while the court evaluated claims about my competence. The timing was crucial because my family's legal action could interfere with my ability to restructure my assets or access the legal protections I'd been developing. The urgency of the situation required accelerating several elements of my strategy that I'd planned to implement gradually. The transfer of assets to Walsh Healthcare Holdings LLC needed to be completed immediately to prevent any court-ordered freezing of my investment accounts. The enrollment in Global Health Solutions Shareholder Protection Program needed to be finalized to ensure access to legal advocacy from the moment any papers were filed. Most importantly, I needed to execute the final element of my strategy that would ensure my family received nothing from the wealth they'd been planning to steal. The charitable giving provisions in my estate planning documents needed to be activated in ways that would permanently redirect my pharmaceutical investment gains away from any family inheritance. The process of implementing these protective measures required coordination with multiple professionals who understood the urgency of preventing family financial abuse. Margaret worked with my investment advisors to expedite asset transfers while ensuring compliance with all legal requirements. The accountants handling my LLC structure worked through the night to complete documentation that would protect my pharmaceutical holdings from any court interference. Dr. Harrison coordinated with Global Health Solutions' legal team to ensure that my enrollment in their shareholder protection program included immediate access to advocacy resources and expert testimony that could counter any competency challenges. The pharmaceutical industry's resources for protecting elderly investors were being mobilized to defend my independence and expose my family's manipulation. The most satisfying aspect of these preparations was their comprehensive nature. Every element of my family's strategy against me had triggered professional responses that would not only defend my competence, but also expose their manipulation and greed. The healthcare industry they'd dismissed was providing legal, financial, and medical resources that would make their campaign impossible to sustain. 2 days later, Eleanor arrived at my house with legal papers and 2 men she introduced as process servers, apparently believing they were about to deliver a conservatorship petition that would give them immediate control over my financial affairs. Instead, they found themselves confronted by Janet Morrison from Global Health Solutions and attorney David Kim from the elder law firm that specialized in defending against family financial abuse. The presence of pharmaceutical industry legal advocates and elder law specialists completely disrupted my family's planned ambush. Instead of serving papers on an isolated elderly woman, they were facing professional advocates who understood their manipulation tactics and were prepared to counter their legal strategy with overwhelming evidence of my competence and their inappropriate behavior. Janet Morrison's introduction of herself as my shareholder advocate from Global Health Solutions immediately established that I had powerful industry support for my investment decisions. Her presence demonstrated that pharmaceutical companies were actively protecting my shareholder rights, and that any challenge to my competence would face opposition from some of the most successful corporations in the world. Attorney Kim's representation added another layer of professional protection that my family hadn't anticipated. His specialization in elder financial abuse cases meant he understood exactly what evidence would be required to counter their conservatorship petition and how to present my pharmaceutical investment success as proof of continued competence rather than lucky confusion. Eleanor's reaction to finding professional advocates in my living room revealed that they'd expected their legal ambush to proceed without any organized opposition. Her confusion about the presence of pharmaceutical industry representatives and elder law specialists demonstrated that they'd underestimated both my resources and my determination to defend my independence. The process servers' attempt to deliver their conservatorship petition became an opportunity for my advocates to document the family's coordinated campaign against my autonomy. Attorney Kim requested copies of all legal papers and supporting documentation, creating an immediate record of their claims and the evidence they intended to present in court. The review of their conservatorship petition revealed the full scope of their manipulation and the cynical way they'd attempted to use my investment success against me. They argued that my pharmaceutical stock gains were evidence of exploitation rather than competence, claiming that healthcare companies were taking advantage of my medical anxieties to encourage inappropriate high-risk investments. Their petition included character assassination disguised as medical concern, describing me as an elderly woman whose judgment had been compromised by prescription medication dependence, and whose investment decisions were being influenced by healthcare companies that profited from her confusion. They requested immediate control over all my financial assets, pending a full competency evaluation. Attorney Kim's response to their petition was swift and devastating. He presented evidence of their months-long campaign to undermine my independence, including recordings of their conversations about liquidating my assets and their inappropriate contacts with my investment companies. He documented their systematic interference with my medical care and their deliberate isolation of me from professional support. Most damaging to their case was the evidence of their premature celebration of expected inheritance and their detailed knowledge of my investment portfolio that contradicted their claims about spontaneous concern for my well-being. Derek's notebook documenting my assets and their value revealed that their interest in my competence was directly tied to their desire to control my wealth. The presentation of evidence against my family's manipulation was comprehensive and professionally devastating. Attorney Kim had assembled documentation that revealed their coordination, their deception, and their greed in ways that would be impossible for any court to ignore. Their conservatorship petition became evidence of attempted elder financial abuse rather than legitimate concern for my welfare. Janet Morrison's testimony about my standing within the pharmaceutical investment community provided additional validation of my competence and sophistication. She explained how my investment strategy had earned recognition from industry professionals, and how my recent gains reflected years of disciplined research and strategic thinking, rather than lucky confusion or outside manipulation. The combination of legal advocacy and industry support created an overwhelming defense against my family's conservatorship petition that exceeded anything they could have anticipated. Instead of facing an isolated elderly woman with questionable competence, they were confronting professional advocates who understood their tactics and were prepared to expose their manipulation publicly. Eleanor's attempt to present character witnesses who would support their claims about my declining capabilities backfired when those witnesses revealed they'd been coached by family members and had received misleading information about my actual condition. Several neighbors and family friends who'd been recruited to support the conservatorship petition admitted they'd never observed any evidence of cognitive decline or poor judgment. The hearing that was supposed to establish my incompetence instead became a showcase for my professional relationships and investment sophistication. Dr. Harrison testified about my recognition within the pharmaceutical industry and my participation in exclusive investment opportunities that required substantial wealth and demonstrated competence. Other pharmaceutical executives provided testimony about my analytical abilities and strategic thinking. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Patricia Hoffman, whose comprehensive cognitive evaluation provided objective evidence that contradicted every claim in the conservatorship petition. Her professional assessment of my exceptional mental capabilities made it impossible for the court to find any basis for questioning my competence or my right to manage my own financial affairs. The judge's ruling was unequivocal and damning for my family's case. He found no evidence of cognitive impairment or incompetence that would justify any interference with my financial autonomy. More significantly, he identified their conservatorship petition as a transparent attempt at elder financial abuse and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. The court's rejection of their conservatorship petition included specific findings about their manipulation and greed that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The judge noted the evidence of their coordinated campaign against my independence and their obvious financial motivations for seeking control over my assets. His ruling included language that would prevent any future challenges to my competence based on the same fabricated evidence. But the legal victory was only the beginning of the consequences my family would face for their attempted theft of my autonomy and assets. The pharmaceutical industry connections I'd cultivated over years of successful investing were about to demonstrate exactly how powerful they could be when protecting one of their most respected individual shareholders. Global Health Solutions' investigation into my family's interference with my shareholder rights had uncovered evidence of attempted fraud that extended beyond their conservatorship petition. Derek's false claims about being authorized to act on my behalf in financial matters constituted identity theft and securities fraud that could result in federal criminal charges. The documentation of their systematic campaign against my competence had also triggered reporting requirements that pharmaceutical companies were obligated to follow when they suspected elder financial abuse. Multiple companies in my portfolio had filed reports with federal authorities about my family's attempted interference with my investment decisions. The most satisfying consequence of their failed legal action was the permanent destruction of any claim they might have had to inheritance from my estate. The conservatorship petition and the evidence it revealed of their manipulation had motivated me to restructure my estate planning documents in ways that would ensure they received nothing from the wealth they'd tried to steal. The updated will and trust documents I'd prepared with Margaret Chen specifically disinherited family members who had attempted to challenge my competence or interfere with my financial independence. The pharmaceutical investments they'd dismissed as confused elderly obsession would instead fund medical research and healthcare access programs that would help thousands of patients receive the medications they needed. The charitable foundations that would receive my pharmaceutical portfolio had been selected specifically for their work in areas that my family had shown no interest in supporting. organizations that provided medication access for elderly patients, research foundations that developed treatments for age-related diseases, and advocacy groups that fought against elder financial abuse would benefit from the wealth my family had tried to claim. The irony was perfect and permanent. The pharmaceutical stocks they'd wanted to liquidate would continue generating wealth for decades after my death. But that wealth would support causes they'd never cared about, rather than funding the lifestyle they'd planned to enjoy. Their greed had motivated me to ensure that my investment success would create a legacy they could never touch or control. The final element of my strategy was the most personally satisfying. I had documented evidence of every aspect of their manipulation. From Derek's notebook cataloging my assets, to Melissa's inappropriate contacts with pharmaceutical companies. This evidence would be preserved and made available to other elderly investors who faced similar family exploitation. The pharmaceutical industry's shareholder protection programs were collecting case studies about elder financial abuse tactics and successful defense strategies. My family's campaign against me would become a teaching example that would help other elderly investors recognize and counter similar manipulation attempts. Their betrayal would serve as a warning to other families who might consider exploiting elderly relatives. Pharmaceutical investments. As I sat in my home office that evening, watching stock prices fluctuate on my computer screen, while surrounded by legal documents that protected my independence and ensured my legacy, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. The medications my family had thrown away were easily replaceable through pharmaceutical industry connections. The wealth they'd planned to steal was permanently protected from their interference. The competence they'd questioned had been validated by some of the most successful companies in the world. My name was Dr. Catherine Walsh, and I'd transformed a defensive battle for my independence into a comprehensive victory that would protect other elderly investors from similar exploitation. The pharmaceutical stocks my family had dismissed as confused elderly obsession had provided the resources and relationships necessary to defeat their manipulation and ensure they'd never benefit from my success. The war for my autonomy was over, and I'd won completely. My family would face the consequences of their greed and manipulation for the rest of their lives, while the pharmaceutical industry they'd mocked would continue generating wealth that would fund medical research and patient care long after I was gone. The same companies that created the medications they'd carelessly discarded had given me the power to discard them from my life and my legacy forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.